Chapter 6. The Strange Crucifixion, Where Jesus is Buried, by Wilson and Blackett. The arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem. The key episode starts when Jesus the Nazarene decides to enter Jerusalem, riding on an ass and the foal of that ass. This is simply acting out an ancient prophecy that would have been known to all the followers of Yahweh, as this represented the long-awaited arrival of the Anointed One. That this ceremonial arrival into the city would have caused uproar is a certainty. That this was the first action in an attempted seizure of control of Jerusalem is an unavoidable conclusion. Several modern authors have pointed out the fact that all the various episodes that are recorded in the Bible accounts of Jesus' ministry were reenactments of very well-known episodes in several ancient religions. The whole idea was to act out the ancient stories and to portray these reenactments as the long-desired fulfillment of well-known prophecies. The storming of the temple. It was impractical for many thousands of people, often coming from huge distances, to bring their pairs of pigeons, their lambs, and their bullocks into the city for ritual slaughter offerings for the God Yahweh. It was necessary for them to be able to buy animals for these primitive religious animal massacres, and it was necessary for them to have facilities to change different currencies and to also simply change coinage to get the correct amounts. The stench of large-scale animal slaughter must have been appalling. Jesus gives the order to buy swords. Then Jesus the Nazarene, who is in various sources described as the Egyptian, ordered his followers to buy swords. Just when he gave this instruction is not clear, and it may have been given well before the Passover. In addition to the Bible accounts of what went on there, it is also the account of the Judean Galilean historian Flavius Jovius, carefully written to avoid Roman displeasure. Jovius states that a false prophet called the Egyptian had gathered 30,000 followers at the Mount of Olives, and he dates this otherwise unrecorded event several years after the period of Jesus the Nazarene. When the attempt to take the temple failed, these 30,000 dispersed and the Egyptian ran away. This may be significant as several ancient sources described Jesus the Nazarene as an Egyptian. This would mean a Judean Galilean who had lived in Egypt. Whether these two quite separate attempted uprisings, some 25 or more years apart, or one attempt that Jovius deliberately obfuscates, is not known. The Appointed One and his followers stormed into the great temple, and there, in the outer courtyard of the Gentiles, they proceeded to cause mayhem by throwing over the tables of the money changers. The attempt to seize the temple, that was thought to be the key to gain control of the city, failed, and this attempt was preserved for prosperity of the faithful as the cleansing of the temple by Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers. This was beginning to be a major riot, and it can only be seen as an attempt to seize control of the temple as the first step in a major insurrection to seize the city of Jerusalem. There was nothing peaceful about this. The result was that the temple guard of somewhere around 200 was called out, and also the Roman city guard of around 500 men. This caused a panic, and in the pandemonium that followed, as the overexcited and disorganized masses who had come for the Passover festival tried to flee, thousands were trampled in the narrow streets of the city of Jerusalem. The attempt at sparking a revolution had failed. The capture of Abbas, the son of Jesus. Then came the really bad news when Jesus the Nazarene was informed that his son and heir, known as Abbas, or Jesus Abbas, the son of the master, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus, the son of Jesus the Nazarene, had been captured by the Roman city guard. The Romans now held all the aces in this political pack. The fact that the Romans had captured the son of the master, who was called Abbas, and a deal was being negotiated to get this Abbas free. The only way to do this was by exchange of prisoners, and the Romans would almost certainly accept the surrender of the leader, Jesus the Nazarene, in exchange for a son. This arrangement had to be very carefully managed because it would involve the all-powerful Roman procurator, as well as the local Techron and Prince Harold Agrippa, or the Sanhedrin of the high priests. This scenario was obvious, and timing was of the essence if it was going to be successful. The deal for the release of Abbas. What then followed was a series of negotiations, and Judas, the brother of Jesus the Nazarene, was obviously the senior negotiator. The deal was that if Jesus surrendered himself to the Roman authorities, then the Romans would release his son, Jesus the Younger, the son of Jesus the Nazarene. This was done, and all that followed will be explained later. Everything that took place in the release of the young man, who was a Roman prisoner in the Garden of Gethsemane, the peaceful surrender of Jesus the Nazarene, the extraordinary rapid series of nighttime and early morning trials, and the strange and unusual crucifixion, revolved around the guaranteed release of Jesus Abbas, the son of the master. The Gospels record how a young man clothed in a sheet was allowed to run away from the garden when Jesus was arrested. The role of Judas. The person chosen to act as the negotiator was Judas, one of the brothers of Jesus the Nazarene. And he was ritually given a piece of bread, and then he went off to see the priests of the Sanhedrin. It was essential for these high priests should have no clear idea of what was happening, and almost immediately they held an illegal meeting at night, totally contrary to Sanhedrin rules. And Judas accepted a reward of 30 pieces of silver for the betrayal of Jesus. If he had not accepted this bribe, then it is virtually certain that his motives would have been regarded with deep suspicion by these high priests. The subterfuge demanded that Judas must appear to be a traitor. The role of Joseph of Arimathea. Is equally obvious that the shadowy Joseph of Arimathea was already involved in the conspiracy, and his participation was vital to the success of the plan. He was friendly with Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, and Pontius Pilate wanted no further trouble in Jerusalem or in Judea in general, as he was not liked by the Emperor Tiberius. If the matter of what was inescapable, one of insurrection against Rome, could be resolved quickly and quietly, then it would be precisely what Pontius Pilate required. So the plot thickens, and when Jesus and his disciples gathered for the famous Last Supper, it is known there were some highly significant statements. First, Jesus informed the gathering that one of them was to betray him and that he was going to select the person who was to betray him by giving him a piece of bread. The dialogue makes it clear that most of the assembled disciples did not have a clue of what was going on. Peter certainly had no idea, and this puzzled recorded questions show. It appears that only the inner circle of Jesus and his brothers knew of the negotiations. In the event, Jesus selected his brother Judas to go off and negotiate with the high priest of the Sanhedrin and the Roman procurator. The gathering at the Mount of Olives. It is then obvious that the remnant of the followers of the Anointed One gathered at the Mount of Olives. And in all of this, it must be remembered that Jesus the Nazarene ordered his followers to sell their belongings and to buy swords. Passover and the Last Supper. It is time to take a careful look at the accounts that surround the events that are known as the Last Supper and the arrest and trials of Jesus, and to avoid wearing rosy-coloured religious spectacles when doing so. First, there is the vital point in these accounts that informs us that the Romans were holding an important prisoner named Barabbas. And as Bar means son of and Abbas means the master, we have the son of the master as Jesus the Nazarene, being held prisoner by the Romans in Jerusalem. This is the critical fact around which everything else revolves. When the Judean Benjamite nation gathered for the annual celebration of the Passover, huge numbers of Judeans assembled at Jerusalem, the site of the great temple of Yahweh. There were at the time 3 great Yahweh temples, as the practice of a widely scattered nation all assembling at Jerusalem was simply not possible. One was Heliopolis in Egypt, where Simon Onius had been given permission by the Pharaoh Ptolemy IV to build a Yahweh temple. It is still there. And the other was at Babylon. There were huge crowds at Jerusalem, and it was at Jerusalem that an attempted coup was made. Jesus arrested. So, with the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas, the plan was rolling. Jesus gathered his few remaining followers at the Garden of Gethsemane and waited for Judas to bring the soldiers to arrest him. As he was guilty of insurrection, there was no way that either the Sanhedrin would try him and convict him, or that the Tetrarch Herod Agrippa would try to interfere. The soldiers finally arrived, led by Judas, who then kissed his brother on the cheek so that he was definitely identified, and Jesus was arrested. The other disciples were still without a clue of what was happening, and Peter, who appears to have been something of an oaf, drew a sword and he hacked off the ear of one of the soldiers before he was restrained. The exchanging of Jesus for his son. In the middle of the action of arresting Jesus and taking him into custody, there was a key moment of the soldiers allowing a young man wearing only a sheet to run from the gardens. This would have been agreed exchange with Abbas, the son, being set free in order to get Jesus to surrender. The strange trials of Jesus. What followed was something of a farce, as Jesus the Nazarene was taken before the Sanhedrin, and there the priests found that he had broken no religious laws. He was, as far as they were concerned, not guilty. Firstly, Jesus was not condemned or executed by the Judean Sanhedrin of priests, as they were not recorded as doing so. And they would have almost certainly had him stoned to death for blasphemy and not crucified. Dealing with insurrection was a matter for Rome and outside their remit and authority. Secondly, he was not condemned to death by Herod Agrippa, the Idunian prince appointed as the local tetrarch by Rome, unless the biblical accounts are incorrect. And again, he would, in all probability, been beheaded by this civil ruler if that ruler had the authority and cause to condemn him. Thirdly, he was condemned by the Roman procurator of Judea, one Pontius Pilate, and therefore the alleged crime was one of insurrection. Jesus was then shuttled back and forth between Pontius Pilate and Herod Agrippa, as Pilate was clearing the decks by cautiously allowing Herod Agrippa to officially affirm that he had no interest in whatever Jesus had done. The final scene that we doubt happened was when Pilate asked the assembled crowd which of the two prisoners he should punish. Should he punish Abbas, the son, or should he punish the father, Jesus? Agitators in the crowd, who were there to make certain that the plot should succeed, shouted and demanded that Abbas should be set free and that Jesus must be the one to be punished, which was precisely what Jesus and his close associates wanted. If there was such a crowd scene, it had to be Jesus who was selected, as Abbas, his son, had already been released in the garden during the previous night. The whole matter of the different trials before the Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate, Herod Agrippa, and Pontius Pilate shuttling the prisoner around Jerusalem was conducted at breakneck speed and was concluded from between the arrest at around 3 a.m. in the morning and around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The site of the crucifixion. It has to be something of a record, as the Judeans and the Romans both had carefully laid down court procedures. Joseph of Arimathea must have been extremely busy, as he had already arranged that the execution by crucifixion was to take place in his garden, where there was his own newly excavated cave-like tomb. He must have made this arrangement with Pontius Pilate before the sentence of death by crucifixion was passed by Pilate. Essenes prepared the tomb. The Bible accounts inform us that two men who were dressed in white entered the empty tomb before the execution began, and we also informed that they had around 110 pounds, 50 kilos of aloes with them. The Essene community always wore white, and they were known as doctors, and aloes are a known cure for bruising, so it is highly unlikely that they were undertakers. Also, Judean males were expressly forbidden to touch dead bodies. It is abundantly clear that these two men who were inside the tomb waiting for a badly bruised and injured living man to be brought into the empty tomb. The cruelty of crucifixion. The cruel and disgusting practice of crucifying victims who had offended rulers or those convicted of the crimes of insurrection or who had committed similar crimes was centuries old before the time of Jesus the Nazarene. The condemned man was scourged and very painfully flogged. Then he was required to carry the crossbeam that he was to be fastened to the place of execution. He had then been badly beaten by the Roman soldiers, who were no doubt angry at having to quell a serious riot and then to spend the night arresting this man and shunting him back and forth across the city all morning and afternoon. So Jesus was unable to carry the crossbeam, and a man named as Stephen was pulled out of the crowd and made to carry the timber. Crucifixion was the punishment for insurrection. In Rome, it was a severe punishment that was made even more painful by nailing the victim who had committed a military offense to a cross or pole, rather than by tying or strapping her arms and legs to the cross or pole with ropes or leather thongs. Nailing was generally specifically reserved for offences committed by members of the military or for those guilty of insurrection. In 135 BC, a slave revolt in Sicily was led by one Unus, who persuaded around 200 slaves to revolt from the misery of the mines. Unus had the stage magician's trick of filling a hollowed out nut with inflammable oil, of then breathing it out as fire. His revolt soon attracted greater numbers of desperate slaves, and his army numbered around 50,000 men, and he actually held all Sicily. Several Roman armies were defeated in the field by the desperate slave army before they were finally defeated. Then, several thousand of the rebellious slaves who clearly thought that fighting and perhaps dying was better than slavery were crucified. Later, in 65 BC, a second slave revolt was led by the better-known Spartacus, and again Roman armies were defeated by the escaped gladiators and slaves. Spartacus had to hide in wooden regions until his army grew to over 10,000 men, and it was not until they had divided their forces against the wishes of Spartacus that the Romans under Crassus were able to defeat them in 71 BC. Again, several thousand of the surviving captured slaves were crucified. Their crime had been insurrection. The Persian emperors had crucified wrongdoers and criminals as early as 400 BC, and so the practice of crucifixion as a punishment was well known, and the sentence and execution of Jesus the Nazarene can be compared with what is generally researched and known. Roman procurators in Judah in Nero's reign crucified thousands of people, and the records blandly state that there was a shortage of timber to carry out these gruesome executions. The location of the crucifixion. 3 of the 4 Gospels chosen by the later church state that the execution was viewed from afar, and the 4th Gospel specifically states it was carried out close to a garden where there was a newly carved out tomb. Therefore, it was on private property. A good case has been made that the crucifixion took place in the valley, nowhere near the favourite guessing site that pilgrims visit today. The size of the cross. The other debatable matter is the size of the cross used in his crucifixion. The Romans did not waste timber, and efforts in crucifying anyone, and the upright of the cross was probably around 7 feet or just over 2 meters tall. All that was required was to get the victim's feet off the ground, and 6 inches, 15 centimeters, would be enough. The same applies to the cross beam, and that would only need to be 4.5 or 5 feet long to get the victim's arms out and strapped or nailed to the crosspiece. The idea of a massive, tall piece of timber raising the condemned man high above the heads of the onlookers is almost certainly another piece of religious fiction. Secrecy. The fact that the crucifixion took place in as private garden makes it an almost secretive and private affair. And as none of the disciples of Jesus the Nazarene were present at his execution, this would appear to be the case. The procedure of execution has been much discussed in recent times, and there is no certainty whether the more common method of fastening the victim's arms to the cross with leather thongs was used, or whether he was nailed through the wrists. The normal method of crucifixion was to use leather thongs, and this may or may not have been the case. Nails driven through the palms of his hands would tear out through from the hands by virtue of the condemned man's body weight. This then brings matters to the vexed question of the actual crucifixion. The place was obviously a private garden and not an open public arena, as it is popularly claimed and exhibited by religionists. There was no crowd of onlookers gathered close by, and instead the matter was clearly held in a private garden with a few onlookers watching at a distance. The gospel accounts indicate that none of the disciples of Jesus the Nazarene were present. Speed of death. One of the most crucial points, as it normally took a relatively young man at least 4 and probably 5 to 6 days to die on the cross. In the case of Jesus the Nazarene, he was placed on the cross on the eve of the Passover, and Judean law prescribed that no person would be allowed to be dead or dying exhibited on a cross or gibbet during the time of the Passover. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour, or 3 p.m., as it would probably be dark by 9 p.m. The time on the cross was limited. Therefore, Jesus was only on the cross for some 4 to 5 hours at most, and the claim that he died in that short period is immediately suspect. Jesus is given hyssop. What happened? The story is that at some point after he had been placed onto the cross, Jesus asked for a drink as he was thirsty. He was then given a drink from a sponge that had been dipped in hyssop, and he soon fell into unconsciousness. Hyssop is a well-known concoction that is laced with opium, and this draught given to Jesus appears to have been heavily laced with opium. When he dropped into apparent unconsciousness, the soldiers who had been assigned to his execution duty were surprised, as victims usually lasted for 3 to 5 days on the cross and not just hours. So, one of the Roman soldiers prodded Jesus in his left side with his spear to test for a reaction. Jesus simply hung there, totally unconscious and apparently dead, and water is said to have run from the wound. From what part of the anatomy water would exit after when cut open is a matter for medical experts. Jesus is removed from the cross. Then came the matter of removing Jesus from the cross, and again the story tells us 2 other victims had been crucified, one on either side of him. These 2, described as thieves, were still alive, and as evening fell and the night of the Passover approached, they had all to be removed from their crosses, as it was not permissible for a condemned man to remain on a cross over the Passover period. The Roman soldiers therefore broke the legs of both the 2 thieves, and this caused them to be unable to hold themselves upright, and their bodies collapsed downwards, and their own weight prevented them from breathing, and they quickly died. The few family and followers present prevented the Romans from breaking Jesus's legs, as they pointed out that he was already dead. It is simple logic that if Jesus was unconscious through drinking hyssop, heavily laced with opium, he was in the same condition of unconsciousness as countless folk are when they undergo operations in our modern hospitals. He was alive, and if the Roman soldiers had broken his legs to make certain that he was already dead, then he most certainly would have died in minutes. In short, Roman soldiers were aware of the value of money, and so was Pontius Pilate. And this passage in the biblical text makes it very clear that Pontius Pilate knew that there was a plot to save the life of Jesus the Nazarene, even if he himself was not directly implicated in the plot. An ancient British religious inscription refers to the secret of the hyssop. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body. Once the crucifixion was completed and the ubiquitous Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross and rushed off to see the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea asked for permission to remove the dead body, ptotem in Greek. Pontius Pilate had checked with a Roman soldier who confirmed that Jesus was dead, and then very pointedly gave him permission to take charge of the live body, soma, meaning not a corpse. Was Jesus dead? This circumvented the normal practice of throwing the bodies of executed criminals into a common pit. Joseph of Arimathea then hurried back to the execution site in the garden, and Jesus' body was taken into the nearby tomb where the two men dressed in white awaited him with 50 kilos, 110 pounds of aloes. Then carefully arranged plan had worked, and much of its success depended on the fact that only a tiny handful of people knew it. The majority of the disciples were not informed, nor were any of Jesus's family. The whole thing had to be done quickly and completed within hours so that the execution could take place and be completed before the Passover began. If things went smoothly and the execution had been held over until the Passover, then there would be little or no chance of him avoiding death on the cross. The Romans ordered the death of Jesus, not the Judeans. The fact that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate to ask for permission to remove the body is evidence that it was Pilate and the Romans who condemned Jesus to death, and not either Herod or the Judean Sanhedrin who sentenced him. In short, the Judeans did not kill Jesus the Nazarene as the Church of Rome alleged for nearly 2,000 years, and instead the accusation that has haunted the scattered survivors of the Judean people for 2 millennia, that they killed Jesus, is plainly wrong. Christian hatred of the Judeans for this alleged murder of their God is plainly, totally misplaced. The Romans allegedly killed him. Did Jesus return from death? Is it possible for a totally dead man to be revived after 3 days of being absolutely dead? The answer is no. It is a medical impossibility. There remained only the matter of allowing the time for Jesus to recover sufficiently for him to travel, as there was no possibility of him remaining in Judea. It seems that some word of strange happenings surrounding the execution of a high-ranking rebel who had been convicted of insurrection against Rome must inevitably got back to the Emperor Tiberius in Rome, and Pontius Pilate was relieved of his duties as the procurator of Syria and Judea, when he got back to Rome. He and his wife were sent into exile. Tiberius would not have wanted Roman imperial authority to be made into a laughingstock, and a senior Roman official branded as a traitor in a ridiculous mock execution. Until around AD 500, Pontius Pilate was revered as a saint by many churches in Egypt. It is a certainty that the future gospel writers would be kept totally uninformed about what had really happened, as too many high-ranking persons would have their reputations and lives at risk. Then there would have been rumours, and gossip is a certainty concerning this affair, as there always is even today. An empty tomb would have taken quite some explanation to the more hard-headed and realistic amongst the authorities who were not directly involved. The idea of the resurrection was the quite logical outcome when several years later the strange Saul Paul became involved. The resurrected Jesus leaves the disciples. The explanation that was introduced was that when the resurrected Jesus, the Nazarene, finally decided to bid farewell to his disciples, he was at a street corner just outside Jerusalem, and it is alleged that he simply became enshrouded in mist, and apparently he floated upwards into heaven. Of all the many quite impossible miracles that are listed in these gospel texts, this has to be the most impossible. And again, it staggers the imagination that anyone can believe it. The truth and reality have a hard time when confronted by faith. This does not devalue the teachings of Jesus the Nazarene, the departure of the Holy Family. It was inevitable that this anointed family, known as the Holy Family, had to be then allowed to leave Judea. And this is when and where the story moves to Britain, around AD 36. In the current crisis in the Roman Church, it is worth noting that St. Peter was obviously married, as evident in Matthew 8:14, Mark 1:29, and Luke 4:38, which refer to Jesus the Nazarene going to Peter's house and healing Simon, Peter's sick mother-in-law. As noted on page 3, rabbis had to be married. Summary of the events around the crucifixion. Tiberius and Sejanus. In AD 33, when this crucifixion drama almost certainly took place, the Roman Empire was, to all intents and purposes, being run by the Etruscan Sejanus, and the Emperor Tiberius was on a permanent holiday in his palace in the Isle of Capri. Pontius Pilate was another Etruscan, was again a friend of Sejanus. In order to preserve peace and some measure of tranquility in Judea, and at the same time to maintain the dignity Roman rule, it appears that Pontius Pilate went along with a scheme that involved an unprecedented flurry of judicial activity. When, with Jesus being arrested in the early hours of the morning, and his son Abbas being released and allowed to run away, and then a succession of trials with Jesus being rapidly shuttled back and forth between the Judean Sanhedrin of priests and the Idumean King Agrippa and Pontius Pilate himself. A quick crucifixion of convenience. The result was a late afternoon conviction of Jesus the Nazarene by Pontius Pilate on the eve of the Passover festival, and a condemned man being quickly crucified. All this was necessary in order to get the matter over before the Passover festival began, and the condemned Jesus was only on the cross for 3 to 4 hours, whereas it usually took somewhere between 3 to 5 days for a person to die by crucifixion. The start of the Passover festival began at nightfall, so it was necessary by Judean law to remove the condemned person from the cross, whether he was dead or still alive. Clearly, Jesus the Nazarene was either still alive and drugged with hyssop, rendering him unconscious, or he was dead and somehow later resurrected. Jesus flees to Britain. As Jesus the Nazarene definitely needed to get out of the Roman Empire after the subterfuge, it becomes obvious that he came to Britain, where the 10 tribes of Israel dwelt, accompanied by some of the 2 tribes of Judea and Benjamin, who had been caught up in the mass Assyrian deportations of 500 BC. The entire Holy Family would have followed the well-known trade route across the Mediterranean to Marseilles and then north up the River Rhone, and then a few miles west to the River Loire and west down to the river to Bordeaux. And finally, they took ship to Britain, safely outside the Roman Empire. It is difficult to know what the controversy is all about. The invention of a resurrection. When Jesus the Nazarene was seen by close family members and followers after the crucifixion, it was necessary to state that he had somehow miraculously returned to life after being dead for 3 days. Restoring life to a corpse after being 3 days dead is a total medical impossibility. It is again logical that the plot to extradite Jesus from the predicament that he was in was only known to a very small number of persons, probably only Joseph of Arimathea, some of Jesus's brothers, and of course the 2 Essene medical experts who hid themselves in the tomb in the garden before the crucifixion took place. The reaction of Tiberius. Tiberius heard of many things, including the tale of a notable Judean who had been condemned and then been rescued from execution, and it is a safe bet that they had Sejanus executed. As Pontius Pilate was a friend of Sejanus, and then his career as the procurator of Judea came to an abrupt end, Pilate was summoned back to Rome and punished by being exiled to a small island. It is a certainty that Tiberius would have not believed in any miraculous resurrection story, and he certainly punished Pontius Pilate and his wife by sending them both into exile. The start of Roman persecution in Britain. That is why there is a grave for El-Ner, the son of Ner in Cumric Wales, was recorded in the Ancient Songs of the Graves, chapter 13. At this stage, it has to be stated that the claims made by the ancient British royal and noble families of a direct ascent or direct descent from El-Ner, the Holy Family of Jerusalem, was multitudinous. In the Harrian MSS 3859, where in circular AD 920, the various linked descendants of Owen, the king of Howell Dar, were set out in 34 listings, the major lists make very direct claims of a descent from Anna, the daughter or wife of Bella Moore and the Holy Family. The same claims are made in list number 10 of this manuscript. There was also very clear claims of direct descent from the Holy Family in the Jesus College 20 MSS. That is another of Britain's most revered ancient texts. That these claims of a direct descent from the Holy Family were very well known is illustrated by the fact that these claims proliferate down through the centuries are generations of Cumric bards and scholars, all copied and recopied the ancient texts in the same way as Israel and Judean peoples recorded and recopied their ancient traditional and biblical texts. This can be shown in the records of the Glamorgan histories of the 18th century. That is why the whole history of ancient Britain and the British nation that is faithfully preserved in Cymric Wales has been attacked by the Roman Catholic Church since that church gained a foothold in eastern Britain in AD 597, and the assault is still ongoing. Please excuse the poor pronunciation of the words used in this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Subscribe to Matt Taylor TV, and you will enter heaven. Subscribe to Matt Taylor TV, and you will be saved. Watching Matt Taylor TV always makes me feel holy. Watching Matt Taylor TV is my naughty secret. Just don't tell my daddy.